Welcome to this afternoon's Hank Center's third annual John Cardinal Newman Lecture. For those of you who don't know what the Hank Center is, it's named after Joan and Bill Hank. Joan was an alum of Loyola, and she and her husband are former trustees of the university. They provided a wonderful endowment to invite faculty and students to recognize, honor, research the Catholic intellectual heritage and its artistic expressions. And we try to do this across the disciplines at the university. The center, commonly referred to as the CCIH, offers programs throughout the year. You'll see some of these things in the back. I bring your attention to two that are coming up very shortly. The Racial Divide in the United States is an afternoon with the Most Reverend Edward Braxton. He is Bishop of Belleville, who is writing a pastoral letter on race right after the things that conspired in Ferguson. He's an African-American bishop, and he wants to bring his own expertise and sensitivity to that. So please notice that's on March 11th. And there's a student event called Catholic Q&A. It's one of 3 events this semester, looking at how what is the relationship between Catholic social thought and political action. And we're looking at 3 different subjects. We did one on abortion, and we're moving into immigration, I think, or capital punishment is the next one. Father Brendan Horan will be part of that, and for our final one, Father Michael Garanzini will end it in April. So the Center's Cardinal Newman Lecture celebrates, or is named after Blessed John Henry Newman, that great 19th century English prelate who wrote movingly about his own experience, his own intellectual journey towards Catholicism in his spiritual autobiography, the Apologia pro vita sua, written in 1864. There's something both ancient and modern about reading Newman's work. Ancient in the way that his intellectual project returns to some of the sources of Christian tradition, but very modern in the way he engages philosophy and social discourses of his own day. Newman's work continues to be a great help to later generations of Catholics and Catholic converts as they map out ways to understand the datum of contemporary religious experience in light of philosophy, theology, literature, and history. So honoring that engagement, the Hank Center each year invites a scholar or artist to recount his own or her own discovery, or perhaps rediscovery, of the Catholic intellectual heritage and how that has maybe influenced their life and their life's work. We're very pleased to have with us this afternoon Professor Colby Dickinson of Loyola's Theology Department. Dr. Dickinson received his doctorate in theology at the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium in 2012. Since then, he has proven to be a very, very productive scholar, working at the intersection between continental philosophy and contemporary Catholic theology. Besides having numerous articles and essays to his credit, he is already the author of 2 books, Agamben and Theology in 2011, and Between the Canon and the Messiah, The Structure of Faith in Contemporary Continental Thought in 2013. He has 2 forthcoming monographs coming out as well, The Spiritual and Creative Failures of Representation on Poetry, Theology, and the Potential of the Human Being, to be published by Fordham Press, and a second, Agamben's Coming Philosophy, Finding a New Use for Theology, to be published with Rowan and Littlefield. Dr. Dickinson's talk this afternoon is entitled Life and Dialogue with Faith, the Subtle Complexities of an Ongoing Conversion. After his talk, there'll be some time for questions and comments, so please help me welcome Colby this afternoon to our conference.
Hello, and thank you very much to Mark for inviting me to give this talk, which I have to say I was really happy to write and to think about giving for a number of reasons, as I hope will become clear in my talk. And I am a frequent drinker of water. If you've been in my classes, you know that. All right. Before class a few weeks ago, a student actually came up and stopped me, and she said, I'm really curious about your story of conversion, how this happened and how it came to pass, and I would be curious to hear the story. As a teacher of theology and as a Catholic, I'm aware that people want to hear from time to time my conversion story. why I made the journey from United Methodist Church of my youth to the Catholic Church of my adulthood. And so I asked myself, at times, the deceptively simple question, why is hearing this story, my story, so interesting? What is it, in fact, about hearing someone's story, their journey of faith, their autobiography, that is so intriguing to all of us? And what is it within such stories that compels us to reflect upon our own stories, the way we construct them, the way we tell them, their meaning and their significance? How is it that such stories, in fact, come to reshape our own stories and make us capable of telling them in quite a different fashion, perhaps profoundly different than how we had told them before? I'm, of course, deeply honored in many ways to be giving this Newman Lecture, so named after one of Catholicism's greatest converts, John Henry Newman, who himself pored over a lifetime of his papers, his publications, his letters, and sentiments you could say were fit only to put in his journal in order to pen his own Apologia, a defense of his own life of faith. Newman himself was well aware, too, that what brought him on this journey from his Anglican youth to his Catholic adulthood were a multitude of factors almost too great to comprehend himself. I would even say too great to isolate or even to begin to order. What allowed him to feel at ease in his newfound Catholic identity was perhaps even something that could never be fully described in words. As he put it, quote, "For who can know himself and the multitude of subtle influences which act upon him?" And I can only say I agree with that sentiment completely. How could I even begin to know myself and the influences that brought me to this place? Staring down the short history of my own life of faith, I find myself in a very similar situation. How can I begin to describe the various probabilities that brought me to the Catholic Church, and how could I even begin to retell that journey to others? But I listened to Newman again. It is the concrete being that reasons. Pass a number of years, and I find my mind in a new place. How? The whole man moves. Paper logic is but the record of it. And so, since you asked me kindly to tell my story, I will try at least to say something. So, my first section is called The Definition or Lack Thereof of Conversion. There's a standard definition of conversion that would indicate something like the movement from one religious tradition to another, conventionally cast as a transition from error to truth. I think this is a very difficult definition to sustain in this day and age, and is mainly, I think, for some people, a very unhelpful grasp of things when we are talking about doctrine, religious institutions, or the cultures and traditions of a given people. Yet there's also a certain truth that still lies in this description, this movement. There's a long history here of forced conversions that it's best not to replicate. And there's a sense today that we're better off respecting the different cultures and traditions that make up today's global network. It's almost merely good manners not to suggest that a Theravada Buddhist from Sri Lanka consider an American Protestant version of Presbyterianism as a more proper fit for them. But then again, there may be some Sri Lankans who feel an inner impulse pushing them toward Presbyterianism, though I suspect such leanings need to come from deep within the person who's contemplating their own conversion and not just some missionary fervor. From another perspective, conversion, of course, can generally mean many things, including a turn from sinfulness to the love of God, whatever this might look like as an embodied religious practice, or a simple change in character, perhaps even simply the turn to an object on our horizon of view quite different from what we had previously been looking at. I think this would sum things up, but I also think, and I doubt, that things were ever so simple or underwhelming for someone like St. Paul, whose eyes were opened by a bright light, and yet he saw nothing immediately afterwards. He saw nothing quite literally until scales, we're told, fell from his eyes. Like a good convert, Paul realized much later that though he had had a tremendous encounter with the divine, he was also not fully formed in his faith and needed to go learn from others what this newfound sense of self was within him. But we should also note, and I think learn a good deal, from the fact that Paul never also fully left behind his Judaic roots. They were very central to the person he remained. Rather, he learned how to translate these roots into a new context, one that was as much Jewish as anything else for him. In fact, I'm not really convinced he disentangled these roots from his faith at all. Maybe this complex and often unfair entangling of the Judeo-Christian can teach us something still about the nature of conversion. My definition of conversion, and here following Paul's lead, is rooted in the Latin sense of conversio, which does indicate a turning round, a change or alteration, but which also indicates a sense of translation taking place, which implies, to my mind, keeping both the languages alive and in play, as it were. It's the idea that conversion entails a necessary translation that intrigues me deeply and gives me some solace, too, because I believe it to be true that when you undergo a religious conversion, you never really leave behind where you came from, but you do translate everything into a new idiom, and you hope you're better off for the effort. If the philosopher Paul Ricoeur is correct, translation is an impossible but necessary task. But it's also one that forces us to see other truths in our life. I would say here's another one given from another philosopher, that we only ever speak one language, but that we never only speak one language. St. Paul would always speak with a rabbinic accent, you might say, and though a good many rabbis might object to his pronouncements on who Jesus was. If there's a truth that I think can be found in the act of conversion as translation, it's one that is the truth of personhood. Like saying, I'm true now. I am true now. Which makes little sense, I think, in the manner of a dialectic between truth and error for some people. But perhaps it makes more sense when we stop to think of Jesus saying that he is the truth, and that that's the only fitting answer to give to Pilate's question, what is truth? Truth is a person. It's the people we all are, but it's also very difficult to live out the truth of ourselves with a sense of spiritual integrity, alongside a vulnerable honesty. I think such acts of translation are very much what conversion's about. For how else are we to understand the processes that are a part of our being, as St. John of the Cross phrased it, wholly converted into divine love? So that converted in his word is this word I'm turning on here. Faith is indeed a relationship about becoming this form of divine love, as St. John of the Cross calls it, which is a verb, not just a noun. We are subjects who act, who are pure acts, in fact, but only in this sense. To suggest as much as to suggest as well that faith is not simply believing that something is or is not true, as Martin Luther had once put it. We actually need to refocus our vision on the persons who stand before the faith, or behind the scriptures, or in the concepts. Who are these people that we are in relation to? What living presence is there in the text itself? This is why I think it does matter, and matter a good deal, when my students ask me about my conversion experience. They want to know the person behind the lecture, the person behind the teacher who stands up and rambles on about nonsense, which is probably what you think I'm doing at this point. They're curious about this. True teaching, I think, is letting the students see who you really are. Just as true service is about being in kinship with those who serve. At least that's how Greg Boyle put it in his book, Tattoos on the Heart. Henri Nouwen once spoke of how we must all undergo a process of what he called continuous conversion. And this, even though he himself was already a Christian, and already a priest, in fact, and a wonderful writer of spiritual books. What is this continuous conversion then we're called to? How do I undergo that, even though I also underwent another type of conversion? I wonder, for that matter, moreover, what does it mean when Pope Francis speaks of a conversion of the papacy that he sees as internal to the Reformation, you could say the ongoing Reformation of Catholicism? What are these things to us? A partial answer, I feel, has to account for the reality that we are continuously needing to experience a spiritual life that we've only heard or read about and not undergone ourselves. We need to experience it, embrace it, and make those words of those who came before us, and put it so well, make those words our own words. This is, or I would say perhaps should be, the experience of reading Scripture, saying prayers at Mass, walking with the saints, learning how to make these words, those words, their words, our own, translating them into our own personal situations, our lives, and then realizing that is conversion. It is a slow and deliberate affair of maturing and of growth. We may be hit by a light from heaven, as St. Paul was, but we still have to submit to those who know more than we do. This is true of St. Paul no less than St. Ignatius. Perhaps our reasons for converting even were not the best. Or perhaps we thought we should be in one place and then we thought otherwise, but now we're back again, kind of like Bob Dylan. I think he was Jewish, then Christian, then he's back to Jewish. But at some point we simply have to look at ourselves and take a good long look at where we are, in the place that we are, and make a movement toward whatever truth lies in front of us. I believe Newman felt this when he declared, quote, "If any Catholic says in consequence that I have been converted in a wrong way, I cannot help that now." Even St. Teresa of Avila admitted she became a nun for the wrong reasons. She said, in fact, I became a nun because I was scared to go to hell, and that was a terrible idea. But it doesn't mean she stopped being a nun. She just learned to see it in a better light. She seemed content to seek God's will in the circumstances in which she found herself. And that, I think, is the more important task. One of the things that most attracted me about Catholics, to be perfectly honest, was that they were in no hurry to jump ship to something else, or even to make sure that they were on the right ship. That may sound crazy, but I actually liked that. I respected that deeply about most of the Catholics I knew. They were just on a ship that some other people had said was a good enough ship. It hadn't yet sunk, or, following G.K. Chesterton, maybe it had sunk, but then it rose back up, and that wasn't a small thing either. I don't think these reflections are devoid of truth. I believe rather they reflect something I had long suspected to be true anyway, that conversion can only really be obtained after we've left behind the impetuous need to convert. So now I'm going to get into a more personal side of this story. In this section I'm calling the definition, or lack thereof, of doctrine. I can safely assume that I think that there are a good many Catholic converts from the Protestant ranks who, when taking some of their first serious glances at the Catholic faith, do what no true Catholic would ever do. We dive headlong into the Catholic Church's official stance on scriptural interpretation. I admit that I did this myself, turning straight to the publications of the Pontifical Biblical Commission, as all good Catholics do, and assuming that whatever this group said about how we should read the Bible was probably foundational for everyone who was Catholic. I now realize that this way of seeing things was both completely wrong, in the sense of common perception and practice, but also that it was completely right, in that it does represent what is happening large scale, in terms of the Church's willingness to work with biblical scholars and theologians and to move toward a better articulation of the deposit of faith in a given context. What I soon discovered, however, was that far from needing to establish my positions on the Church's teachings, something I don't think I've ever been particularly good at, it was rather the life of faith that was being lived by the faithful that moved me the most. Newman knew of this as well. He says, quote, "I contrasted her creed," meaning the Church's creed on the one hand, "with her ordinary teaching, her controversial tone, her political and social bearing, and her popular beliefs and practices on the other." I think this we must all do, and I believe we're better off for having seen the complexity and diversity that is present within an institution so large and unwieldy at times, it truly boggles my mind. Newman lists them: confraternities, particular devotions, reverence for the Blessed Virgin, prayers for the dead, beautiful churches, munificent offerings to them, and in them, monastic houses, and many other observances and institutions. Newman saw them all before him, and knew that these truly unfathomable riches were what actually comprised the Catholic Church, and this is what he wanted to really partake in. I would say that something similar was appealing to me at the time when I was considering becoming Catholic. Beyond the almost cliched experiences of a Protestant about to become Catholic but totally unaware of it, often saying things like, I'm just really interested in church history, you know, whatever happened before the Reformation. If you hear a Protestant say that, they're on their way to Catholicism, they just don't know it. And they're not aware of it themselves. But like that group, I was starting to gravitate toward Catholic practices with a startling regularity. The many hours that I had spent in the chapel at a small Carmelite monastery in St. Louis were beginning to take their toll on me. I was amazed, actually, at how silence and private meditation, in the context of a chapel or a monastery, even in the midst of other people being there, they had a place in this particular faith. People made intentional room for this stuff. Catholics did not necessarily always come together just to see each other, but to pray on their own in a space that was demarcated as holy in some sense. Apparently there were spaces that just had a quality about them. Now, you have to forgive me, but that was a radical notion to me. I didn't know that existed. Generally, in my world, you gathered for worship to see other people as much as to actually be there to worship. I know they sound terrible, but the big joke about Methodists is that we all get together for potluck dinners. That's the most important thing. And you're there to talk about the food and just kind of wave at people and how's it going. I thought that's what church was. But here, what I was finding was actually what I would call a respect for a space and for silence that, to be perfectly honest, I wasn't fully comfortable with, but that I was wanting to become comfortable with, if you know what I mean. I wanted to grow into that, and I knew I wasn't quite there yet. I knew I was tired, though, of meeting in a school gym or someone's home for church. I wanted a space. That's why even to this day, ideas like pilgrimage take on a very symbolic significance for me. That idea that I'm trying to go somewhere in search of something, and I believe I can find it in a place. In his Anglican tract writing days, Newman felt the Catholic Church, quote, alone amid all the errors and evils of her practical system. And I love this. We call him blessed. He's even saying, among all the errors and evils of the Church's practical system, has given free scope to the feelings of awe, mystery, tenderness, reverence, devotedness, and other feelings which may be especially called Catholic. I won't claim myself that Catholics have a monopoly on these sentiments, but I too began to find these feelings to be, even to my non-Catholic mind, what I saw profoundly at work in the Catholic Church, and often in very comforting ways. For almost 5 years during this time, I started, and I did it throughout the 5 years, but I met with a Dominican spiritual director who taught in St. Louis at the Aquinas Institute of Theology. And what I gained from the experience was not just a greater sense of spiritual direction in my life, which I hope I did gain, but also the immediate confirmation that such practices were an accepted part of living a life of Catholic spirituality. And you can just imagine when I would tell family and friends I was meeting with a Dominican priest for spiritual direction, because I wasn't Catholic yet, they would just look at me like, what is that? And what are you doing? And does it have any relevance or meaning? And it was hard for me to unpack how much it meant to me, or how much that particular person meant to me who was trying to help guide me, because that practice wasn't part of where I came from. I find it very ironic sometimes that one of the standard critiques of Catholicism by a good many Protestants is that Catholics lack a personal relationship with Jesus. I don't know if you heard this personal relationship language, but or that they often lack a passionate commitment to faith. I've actually had Catholic students when I taught high school who would come up to me, and I would say these students were students of great faith, but they would come up to me and they would be disturbed because someone had said they didn't have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ as their personal Lord and Savior. And they weren't sure how to understand that comment. They would come ask me, do I have a personal relationship with Jesus? Do you know? And I had to translate for them. Say, well, it means something different maybe to them than it means to you. But that's okay. I have actually found quite to the contrary that the deep well of spiritual writings, practices, and guidance which the Catholic Church maintains is so deep that one can almost drown in it. For my part, I am really content on a personal level, this is how it feels to me, just to take a quick swim in that deepness. I can hardly handle Ignatius's spiritual exercises, which I'm doing with this SEAL retreat this year, and that's already so much it blows my mind. These are more than enough, I would say, to revolutionize my life of prayer and to personalize, through the imagination, my relationship with Jesus, among others. The thing that I'm actually trying to express here, I think, is quite simple. I was happily overcome by the myriad lives of faith that were worshiping and adoring and praying and living lives of faith in so many different and colorful ways. And this has only been expanded as I've traveled the globe and I see different Catholics in different countries, and it gets more colorful and it gets more vibrant, not less. And I was, as a good Protestant might say, blessed to see this swelling mass of the practicing people as the real face of the Catholic Church. I think Newman saw this very clearly too. He says, indeed, it is a simple fact to say that Catholics have not come to believe because it is defined, but that it was defined because they believed it. And what these masses of people who believe, what they have believed over time, should not shock us. It should not even differ from what it is that moves us, even though we don't often know what it is that is at work within us. Newman puts it this way, quote, perhaps I and others actually have always believed it, and the only question, which is now decided on my behalf, is that I have henceforth the satisfaction of having to believe, that I have only been holding all along what the apostles held before me. You could say the beliefs and practices of the masses of humanity is what drew me. Much as I would add Dorothy Day herself was drawn to Catholicism because in a very simple way she said that's where all the poor people went. She was here in Chicago, downtown, and she was watching the immigrants and the poor who were living very miserable lives go to church. And she said, I want to go where those masses are going to. The destitute, you could say, and yet the positively worshipful people who found themselves on their knees, somehow filling themselves with a hope that came from beyond themselves. Perhaps several contemporary voices are correct. This is the domain I study and write about, so. Perhaps several contemporary voices are correct when they suggest that true religion has no real doctrinal content, but is a pure state of openness to receive a mystery beyond ourselves and our words, our institutions, and our representations of the divine. I think there is, in fact, much profit to be gained from sharing with these thoughts. But I would also counter that there is a long history of trying to wrestle with exactly these positions, and that struggle, paradoxically, is what the creeds and the doctrines are or should be about in the first place. We say we believe in one God who is involved with everything, both seen and unseen, and this, of course, includes quite a bit of tension between the two. And then we say we believe in Jesus Christ, who's essentially the declaration within a particular moment in history that God isn't who you thought God was. This broken image of God, we could call it, and that's what we do when we break it at Mass. This broken image of God, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins and then is snapped in half, is what God is in fact what is later seated at the right hand of the Father, as the creed goes. And it is unpronounceable, and it is a profound mystery that we will never grasp. And it's beyond any description I could give of it, and this is what the Church has been saying and struggling with this whole time. I get very frustrated sometimes when we think the creed is just simply the statement you have to bow down to, and it's so defined, and I feel bound by it, when in fact the whole point of the creed, it seems to me, is that we all can't make sense of it. And even what we thought God was isn't what we thought God was, and that's what we're trying to articulate. I certainly do think we often misunderstand the true nature of God's glory, confusing it with human glory, and often with sovereign power, at times substituting our plans for God's. But this is, as Newman might say, a difficulty for faith, and not a substantial doubt. When people ask me why I'm Catholic, I give the single most important reason that I know of, and it's also the one I think it's the most disappointing to my students. Because I think they expect some answer like, I have reasoned it all out, and I have all these arguments as to why it's the best faith ever. But actually what I say to them is, it was the Catholic people that I knew, the friends and colleagues I had. I liked them. They seemed very nice, and they were very balanced. And I kind of got caught up in that community of relationship with them, and I wanted to be part of the communion I could have with them. It was the relationships that brought me to faith. There were many factors, to be sure. It's not the only one. But this was what drew me in the most deeply, and I have no shame at all in saying that. Faith is a relationship. And it was these relationships that drew me in deeper to the Catholic traditions and practices that were going on all around me. I, in fact, believe that even this God that I worship exists as a being so devoted to relationship that God's in relationship with God's own self. This is the idea of the Trinity, of course. Rather than take any amount of time contemplating the existence of God, I actually don't find those enterprises to be very exciting or satisfying at all. I don't teach those in my classes. Do we know if God really exists? I don't care. I don't care in arguing it. This isn't important to me. What I care about is that this God is a God of love so great that even God has to relate to God's own self. And that such love overflows, as Bonaventure put it, to humanity in a way so profound that it marks God forever after as bearing a wound that humanity fills. And I think that's enough for me. That's enough. I was reading something similar, by the way. After I'd already written this, and then I read Walter Casper's book on mercy, and he's saying that. He's saying there's this understanding of God as a God of mercy that is everything. And it seems at times to even be in tension with God as an omnipotent, all-powerful, all-knowing, whatever. And he says we have to go to mercy first. Everything else gets directed from that place. This section is called the definition or lack thereof of baptism. When I was going through the RCIA process, I was asked at one point to produce my baptism certificate. And I was told this will be enough for the Catholic Church. And so, for example, my wife contacted the church where she was baptized, and it was a Presbyterian church, and they happily sent her a copy of her baptism certificate. Fantastic. It gets you in the door. So I emailed my dad, because my dad's a Methodist pastor. He was my pastor. And I asked for my copy. On the phone about a week later, my parents confessed to me that due to a technicality, my dad's actually being a Wesleyan pastor for the 6-month period when I was an infant and should have been baptized, and the Wesleyans not believing in infant baptism as the Methodists do, I actually wasn't baptized. So, despite my having been a Methodist pastor for a year, and my having baptized people during that period, and despite my father being present at that, and could have said something like, that's bizarre, turns out you're not baptized, and despite my mother claiming vehemently that I was baptized in her heart, though no water was involved, I discovered for the first time that I was never baptized. You can imagine the looks of surprise on my students' faces at the all-girls Catholic high school I taught at in St. Louis. Not only were they shocked to hear that I wasn't Catholic, and they really did kind of, you're not Catholic? But it was positively absurd that I wasn't even baptized. I was their pagan teacher. I had one of my older colleagues there. She was a pre-Vatican II lady, wonderful lady, but she laughed her ass off at this. And she said, you're one of those pagan babies I used to pray for in school. She was very pleased to see her prayers had finally paid off. At the time, I was taking classes part-time through St. Louis University at Kinrick Seminary as part of a master's in religious education. And one of my instructors there, who also happened to be superintendent of religious education for the Archdiocese, he once remarked to me that as a matter of policy, you shouldn't hire non-Catholics to teach religion in a Catholic school. And then again, he said with a smile, but it seems to have worked out in your case just fine. Now, I laughed at that at the time, but I also thought deeply about it. And I was very impressed with it. I thought to myself, perhaps I can be Catholic. To be sure, having taught the faith in such a context, I was more or less inclined to agree with him. It's very difficult for a Protestant to come into a Catholic high school and try to teach religion. But I was also glad there were exceptions to every rule, and that for some reason I wasn't even myself even able to explain. Such exceptions seemed to be more common in the Catholic Church than I had expected. It was as if Catholics expected exceptions to be there, and that was kind of how things should be. See, I was raised in a church where if you were an exception, you're supposed to go find a different church for people who are that exception. But for some reason, Catholicism always has seemed to me like a place where the exceptions, we sort of expect them to kind of crop up occasionally. That's okay. I think what I'm trying to say is that in the Protestant world, my understanding was that there was a lingering understanding of community that existed to strive for a certain ideal. And if the community doesn't live up to that ideal at times, you have a duty to seek out a more perfect church elsewhere. And to be perfectly honest, at that point in my life, I was tired of this potential for a state of almost permanent dissatisfaction. And I longed for a community that was willing to admit it had faults, perhaps even many faults, in its structure and in its past. I would say that the permanent dissatisfaction was almost inbuilt, so to speak. And that's when I met Catholics who were always dissatisfied. But it didn't mean they would leave. One of my first meetings with the Archdiocese of St. Louis, I was asked to go there, and I sat in the front row, and it was all the chairs of departments in high schools, and I sat next to a newly ordained bishop, and he borrowed my pen. And then he got up to talk about some program in the Archdiocese, and some nun in the back just went off on him and was yelling at him and telling him how terrible this plan was. And he took it all with stride and just kind of rolled with it. It was at the time, the newly ordained bishop was Timothy Dolan. And I thought to myself, this guy's going places, because he was rolling with it. It didn't bother him. But I thought to myself, this was so different than the antagonistic battles I had seen and witnessed in my youth, in my church. There was something else that drew my attention. For these battles, for this willingness to be dissatisfied, I thought to myself, look no further than the Catholic faith, which has certainly had its share. There are, of course, many terrible things tucked away in the Catholic Church's history, and I would say in its present manifestations as well. But in seeing these things, which I confess I almost delight in seeing at times, I also abide by a principle I heard a priest once express in a homily. And this is when I was becoming Catholic. He said, to reject the church because of its dark past is at the same time to not want to deal with your own dark past. Now I thought to myself, that's quite a stretch. And then I thought about it more. And I thought there's something to this. I found myself hearing what I would call a truth and wanting to face my own past as well, in all its darkness. And I still want to today, even though it's often painful, and I would say generally horrifying to do. So I stand here in a sense today as a Catholic, wondering what it means to enter into community with other persons who are willing to admit their own dark pasts, to confess their sins openly to others, and to move forward with the other sinners who surround them in the thick of life and unafraid. I believe unapologetically that this is what it means to claim we acknowledge one baptism for the forgiveness of sins. That is, when you're in a community that provides a loving or forgiving foundation for finding yourself and your faith, you need only show it who you really are, and you are accepted. I think of this when I read Catholics like Richard Rodriguez, who struggle with their place in the Catholic Church, but also seem content to be a prophetic voice within it. Sometimes on the margins, sometimes moving toward the center, but continuously focused on what makes a person's faith flourish in today's world. It was Rodriguez who recently, I would say, hit the nail on the head when he said in his memoir, Darling, penance is a sacrament out of line with the postmodern sensibility, for it seeks to alleviate sin, a word we no longer employ. And I think he's right, of course. Even those of us who claim that the practice of confession still has a deep meaning and significance, we aren't quite sure how to live out a life in reconciliation. I would say, for example, professionally, where the admittance of fault can often see you demoted or looked down upon, even humiliated. What the body of Christ should be, I spend a lot of time stressing this with students, maybe what you saw or experienced wasn't this, but what it should be, what you can claim it needs to be, I would say in your own life, is something different. Something we can all drift toward and appreciate, I think. It's a body that is particularly attuned to the ways in which confession elevates the soul, allows us to enter into life more authentically, more fully. This also means that being Catholic to me means not being part of a group with a discernible political identity that I get proud to say, I'm Catholic. Standing strong as Catholics. I think what it means is that we're willing to be God's people on this earth, which has a slightly more humble tone to it. In Rodriguez's words, the opposite of being God's people is an attempt to possess God. To see how, quote, we are his people becomes he is our God. The blasphemy that attaches to monotheism is the blasphemy of certainty. If God is on our side, we must be right. We are right because we believe in God. We must defend God against the godless. Certitude clears a way for violence. End quote. But this is not what it means to be content in the faith, to flourish in one's faith as a Catholic. That is, for those religious persons who would rather beat you over the head with their image of God, a false one, no doubt, one that needs to be defended zealously, because otherwise its hollowness will collapse on itself. For Catholics, I would rather claim there's no need to defend the faith in this way. There's an ease that comes with being Catholic, an openness that can never be mistaken for hostility if it's practiced rightly. Even when it feels like it may in fact be the case that the hierarchy of the church is oppressing you, and this does happen, we can't forget our own worth in the midst of this. As Newman had put it, quote, "It is the individuals and not the Holy See that have taken the initiative and given the lead to the Catholic mind in theological inquiry." And I agree. I recall two moments of such a difference in my own conversion story. The first being a Marianist missionary, and I admit I still don't know much about the Marianists. I'm really not sure where they come from here. But a Marianist missionary who knocked on my door one afternoon when we lived in St. Louis. It was kind of a surreal experience because I've talked to many missionaries who were looking to convert people. They were all Protestant, and such conversations I think often go terribly wrong. But this individual simply knocked on my door and asked if I had any questions about Catholicism. We know what it was about, or if I was interested in hearing more about what the church down the street was up to. We talked, very pleasant chat, and then he left, and there was no demand for anything, no feeling I had to do anything, just an openness to any spark that might be there within me. I almost hate to admit it, a Marianist missionary at my door, he was somewhat successful. My second story comes from the mouth of a high school student I taught who went to a very large evangelical rally, along with some of her Catholic youth group. As she described it, she said they went in disguise. She goes, "We were all Catholic, but we just went in, we didn't tell anyone we were Catholic. We were a little nervous how they might feel about Catholics." She confided to me that they kept this low profile too because they actually did hear the occasional anti-Catholic sentiment creep out of someone's mouth when they were at this rally. Now, I must admit I was completely amazed at how this young girl was willing to step outside of her comfort zone into a group of persons she knew might contain some others who may not like her just based on the fact of who she is. And yet she did so. She went to this because she said she wanted to learn more about her faith, about Jesus, about the Bible, and so on. And she felt Protestants might have something to teach her about this. She told me of how they had gotten into a small group. This is Protestant lingo. They got into a small group where they talked about how to speak to non-believers about faith, how to defend the faith to others. In fact, how to convert them to Christ. This was, after all, it was a crusade is what they called it, called Christ Power. That was the name of the thing. After sharing a good deal of her own experience of this group, she looked at me and said something to the effect of this. "You know, after I left there, I thought to myself, I really should learn how to defend my faith in case I ever run into these people again." Now, I laughed so hard at that statement. I laughed so hard because to me it revealed the truth of what was going on there. She had sensed what was going on behind their attempts to defend their faith. It really only mattered to those people. Their perception was it matters to everyone else. We have to go out into the world and fight. And she thought it just really mattered to them and I should learn how to talk to them. In her own groundedness as a Catholic, she felt no need to go out and defend her faith to people on the street. What she really felt a need was to grow more deeply into her own spiritual life and relationships, and then to let that rub off on other people. I would say a truer form of evangelization. Since becoming Catholic, Newman himself declared, "I have been in perfect peace and contentment. I have never had one doubt. It was like coming into port after a rough sea, and my happiness on that score remains to this day without interruption." I think, in fact, I might say something similar, as strange as it is to hear myself say that. And it comes from a deep place within me, one where the difficulties might storm on at times, but doubts in this foundation really haven't taken root in me. Any defense I give of this faith should come across more like this and less like the Christ power, what do you call him, the Christ power zealot. So let me talk about the definition or lack thereof of love. Being raised in the United Methodist Church, I was always circulating around theological questions, though I did not know always how to properly frame them. I recall once considering how we could all be said to be one body in Christ on Sunday morning. This is how it was always framed for me. On Sunday, we're all one body in Christ as Christians, united with all other Christians around the world. Someone told me that at one point. But come Monday, I thought, come Monday morning when church is over, couldn't we be called by our country to go to war against other Christians in other parts of the world? And I was confounded. I was very young when I had this thought, actually. Which took priority over which? The church or the nation? And wasn't I also to extend the same level of respect or love to the stranger and the foreigner who may not even be Christian? So how could I hate them in another context, but be bonded to them in another one? Abraham had welcomed the strangers, didn't he? So did Lot, and this was a sign of their righteousness. But what about the declared enemy? Could I welcome them only if I didn't know they were really the enemy, but then get them if I found out they were? And who was the enemy really anyway? Didn't we sometimes fall in love with the enemy, like Romeo and Juliet? These things troubled me as a little kid. Through these questions, which my young mind would not drop, I was, as you could say, exposed to a world of tensions that would not go away, and which would cause me at certain points in my life to have to critically examine my beliefs. When I first studied theology at a formal level, which wasn't until grad school, I recall having to ask myself whether or not violence was even possible as a Christian, and if so, how could it be justified? Such questions pushed me to take my faith seriously, but also to try to bear witness to the faith that had motivated me to undertake these studies in the first place. Unexpected, I didn't know who this guy was till I was in one of his classes. This is how naive I was. But one of my teachers at the time was Stanley Hauerwas. He's a fierce pacifist who draws these amazing pictures that are very vivid of the violent self in the midst of theology. And I've since learned in a way to take this portrait very seriously as a further means toward understanding the love that Christians are called to embody. As he pointed out, there's a particular difficulty in learning not just to forgive, but to be forgiven as well. That is, to let someone else enter that position wherein we feel they could control us. As he describes the feeling of being forgiven, we get a sense that things really couldn't be worse than allowing ourselves to be forgiven. He says, to be forgiven means that I must face the fact that my life actually lies in the hands of others. I must learn to trust them as I have learned to trust God. Now, this isn't necessarily a call to blind trust as some of us think of it, just check reason at the door and dive in. It's a recognition that we are always a self that is interrupted by an other self who actually does affect our lives. It's a significant emphasis as well on the power of obedience and that obedience has in shaping one's life of faith. Now, if you've been listening, this is basically what I've been describing as my relationship to the Catholic Church, letting others who were right there in front of me in, letting them be in relationship to me, and following them into a place where they find faith. The fear, however, is that the moment we let down our guard, admit a weakness, show our failures for what they are, then there'll be those who will smell blood in the water, and like a shark, they'll go in for the kill. Like watching a first-year high school teacher display even a smidgen of insecurity in the classroom. I had to watch that one time, and it was awful. In reality, how can we go about actually addressing this issue? How can we allow someone, maybe even someone we don't like that much, to be vulnerable before us, or we to be vulnerable before them, and neither of us try to take advantage of the situation for our own gain or to control one another? I think that's the fear a lot of people have about the Catholic Church, that it's trying to, control something or take advantage of them. Trying to find a solution to this problem is analogous to our inability to fathom what we should do in the face of war and international hostility. Shouldn't we take advantage of another's weakness in order to gain control of the situation? How can we imagine doing anything otherwise? I believe we do have to learn to live, as Hauerwas himself puts it, but so does Adrian Rich, as a foreign people, one permanently living in exile, as the Israelites did, as Jesus did with his disciples, having no place to rest his head. That is, we have to learn to live detached from our securities and their necessity, even the tyranny of security. As Hauerwas puts it, when we exist as a forgiven people, we are able to be at peace with our histories, so that now God's life determines my whole way of being, our character. We no longer need to deny our past or tell ourselves false stories, as now we can accept what we have been without the knowledge of our sin destroying us. As during the priest's homily I heard many years ago about accepting our own dark pasts, I'm opened up by these insights toward myself, just as strongly as I am opened up toward others. I think these actions, of course, are the opposite of trying to be the Christian who strives to maintain some sort of moral perfection, of a personal sovereignty over themselves, in the sense that they seek to go forgive others through their own charitable giving out of their own wealth, rather than to give out of their poverty. I think there's no poverty of spirit in that image of a Christian to be blessed. We should not be surprised, I would add, when such figures have deep scandals in their lives that they would either hide or simply ignore. We should also not be surprised that such a stance often leads to strict boundaries being drawn up between the saved and the damned. In contrast to this, Jesus' message seems rather to come out of a brokenness that we're able to enter into only through allowing ourselves to admit our brokenness and allowing ourselves to be forgiven. It may sound very simple, and I think it is in a way, but one of the things that drew me to Catholics was the culture of Catholics where they drank and they smoked and they sweared. And I thought, okay, something's different here. They're not striving for a certain form of moral perfection that I had been trying to live up to in a different world. There was an admittance. There was sort of part of understanding we're not going to be perfect. Sometimes we get tipsy. That's just who we are. Not that that's always an ideal to lift up. It's not that either. I think love is, as Hauerwas defines it, the nonviolent apprehension of the other as other, which sounds a lot like Jacques Derrida to me as well. To see this other, he adds, is frightening. Quote, because to the extent others are other, they challenge my way of being. And that's how I often see the Catholic Church. It's completely other to me at times. It's so foreign, even still. And as a convert, it's so foreign to me. And its otherness is weird to me. How do I let it challenge or change my way of being? I think this would be to let ourselves be disturbed by the other, something we fight hard not to have to go through. And this is why we spend so much time trying to find friends who are so much like us, so that we don't have to face the otherness we really fear having to be around. It's uncomfortable, and we don't like that too much. It's that passage in the Gospels about when you invite someone to a dinner, invite the people on the street, not your friends, because your friends will have you back. Who the hell does that? Because we don't like that feeling. We don't like having to invite in the person who is permanently other to us. I'm not really sure, however, that there's another way to access love other than letting go of this desire for safety and sameness in the midst of our fears. The more successful we are at our deceptions, Hauerwas continues, the more we feel the necessity to protect ourselves from any possible challenge. It's in this sense that, quote, we are nonviolent as long as no one challenges our turf. So violence becomes needlessly woven into our lives. It becomes the warp on which the fabric of our existence is threaded. The order of our lives is built on our potential for violence. And I think we have such trouble admitting that we are indeed violent people, and that such violence is spread quite easily into everything we do, the way in which we do it, in fact, as well. But it's there, in that same space, and if we're able to spot it, that you see it growing in every corner of your life. Now, I try to be attuned to this violence that is operative even in me, even in my work, my teaching, and though it's certainly hard to do, especially as a white, male American, wealthy, you could say, heterosexual. I've never walked into a class and heard a professor who fits those descriptions proclaim that before we can even try to understand the sovereignty of God, we must take seriously the sovereign claims of humanity and how each of us, particularly myself, and those in those categories, is tempted at times to try to be God. I have to say that when I teach. I find it difficult to talk about God's qualities sometimes because I was raised as a white male American who's wealthy and affluent, heterosexual. I'm taught to be God, to be in a position of power. There are many religious memoirs written by women who went in search of God but then discovered they were really searching for the ideal man. Yeah? There's a series of these memoirs. They thought it was God, but it was really an idealized image of a man they were looking for. But where are the confessions to be written by men who realize they themselves are trying to be the God they were looking for? And now they're going to abandon this insane quest and learn to listen to something beyond themselves, something entirely dependent upon others. I'm still looking for those memoirs in a way. In my conversion, and this is what I think it's about, this is part of the process of converting, of turning around. I began to sense that submitting to something like the Catholic faith was how I experienced this truth in my life. There was an otherness to the church that unsettled me, and still does. It's like, I mean, I can only imagine my son just went through this recently, going through reconciliation for the first time. I mean, my experience of it as an adult, I have to do what? I have to go in there and say, what? I don't want to do this. And I think that's the position of a lot of students I teach. Who wants to go in and confess your sins to the priest? Ugh, I'm just going to do it on my own to God, thanks. Which means I'm never going to do it. I think there's a profound powerness to this otherness. There was something present in these practices and in these Catholics I met who fully acknowledged that, yes, the church is broken, but also that it was a sure path toward accessing love, which slowly became less of a contradiction to me and more the reality of how we actually fall in love through seeing the brokenness of the other person. I will often say this to my students, maybe I've already said it, I don't know, but I mean, when you see the brokenness of the other person before you you're in love with, and they're willing to show you their brokenness in all its ugliness, but they still stay there, and you still welcome them there, that's the sexiest thing you could encounter in a relationship. And if you don't know that experience, I'm sorry. You've been trying to be something you don't need to be. That is attractive. And that's what I found, in a sense, in the Catholic Church. Catholics who would stand up and say, it's totally broken. What a mess, but I'm here. I'm here for the long haul. And I began to sense that's where their love for the church came from. From the cultural and gender theorist Judith Butler, some in the church might call her a gender ideologue, but I do not. From her, we take these lessons on love that I think resonate deeply with what I've been pursuing throughout my talk here. On the failures of representation as the only way to actually access a universal truth, or something like a universal truth. That precisely is what love is. In her words, and I like this, she says, on occasion when I'm getting to know someone, when someone seeks to know me or indeed find in me the occasion for love, I'm asked what my idea of love is, and I always found her. This is Judith Butler, someone I respect immensely for her, her amazing erudite writings, and just, she's so well worded, I think. Some people think she's impossible to read, but I think it's great. But she can't even begin to describe what this love is. There are clearly those, she goes on, who have their ideas of love, who enter into their conversations, their letters, their initial encounters with an idea of love in mind. This is admirable in a way, and I'm somewhat embarrassed by the fact that I have no answer, and that I cannot, in the moment of potential seduction, have an entrancing view of love to offer the one with whom I speak. One knows love somehow only when all one's ideas are destroyed. And this, becoming unhinged from what one knows, is the paradigmatic sign of love. That's how she puts it. I think St. Paul would completely agree with this formulation, and probably be shocked that he would. For he too knew what it meant to find all of your identities broken, spilt on the ground, but also how this pouring out of the self, we could say, can also give way to a new identity that's really a non-identity in Christ, a death to the self, a dying with Christ. I would only add to Butler's account of love that this is what I believe the church has been trying to struggle with for all this time. For so long, in fact, that it's almost embarrassing how we don't turn to its resources when we struggle with formulations like love. when we might actually need its insight most. Okay, so in conclusion, I begin with Newman again, for he's helped me to frame my story in a number of respects. He says, I am Catholic by virtue of my believing in God. And if I am asked why I believe in God, I answer that it is because I believe in myself. For I feel it impossible to believe in my own existence without believing also in the existence of God, who lives as a personal, all-seeing, all-judging being in my conscience. I can honestly say for my part that I think I'm just beginning to see what he might have meant by these words, and I'm very grateful for that insight. It's been a marvelous treat to me to be able to go back over my own story of conversion in some ways. Very piecemeal, I know, but it's because no one thing jumped out and said, now's the moment. It was a relationship. It's like when you say, well, I fell in love when I met this person, but then of course we had a fight, and then of course this happened, and it's been a long road. But I'm here. But it's been a treat to go over it and to isolate a few moments that have meaning for me. I was deeply reminded as I put all this together of how rewarding the journey has been for me. And I would say of the good many voices that I could relate to and that sustained me with a word when I was weary. I would ask your forgiveness if this talk was not academic or intellectual enough, but I have a reason for this and I think it's a good one. You see, I'm actually a thought-based person, almost entirely, though I'd say there's a touch of intuition in me as well. Yet I have discovered over the course of the years that one of the most powerful ways for me to encounter God, and I would say my own self wrapped up in faith, buoyed up by faith, has actually been through my feelings and not my thoughts. As difficult and challenging as such a thing is for me, it is my reality. I think it's a wonderful reality. And I have to give it space to operate at times, to even move within me, beyond my efforts to put it into words or to put thoughts around it. In fact, it means that at times, and this is the scary part, at times I'm completely dependent on other people to let me know that what I'm feeling might in fact be God, and that my brain just isn't able to name it. See, those of us who are thought-based, and academics have a lot of these people, we're tempted to say if I can't name it or put my thoughts on it, it must not be a real experience. And I say I'm very grateful for things like spiritual direction or talking to people who can say, no, go back. That might have been God moving in your life. It's a humbling experience to be sure, but I'm very grateful for the voice of others to tell me I might have missed something otherwise. I'm somewhat decent, I would say, at describing my thoughts. I hope, at least that's the path I'm trying to work myself down. But my faith, well, that's a struggle. But it's one that I find yields far more significant results than anything I could publish or even think about. You probably realize we live in an age that is dominated by reason and rationality, by thought-based people. And mainly I love this, right? I don't suffer in this scenario. I thrive. I get a chance to flourish in this in ways that are, quite frankly, very unfair to those of you who are based in your feelings. It's a discrimination more problematic, I think, than extroverts dominating over introverts, although there's an overlap in relationship here. It was Aquinas, after all, who had an experience that made everything he had written feel like so much straw to him. I must confess, that sounds pretty good to me. And I'd like to know more about that side of his life. And this is why I'm a Catholic, because I'm still digging into its riches, looking for a thicker experience of what that might feel like for me as well. What would it mean to say, all my writing is as straw, when I'm working so hard to write all the time? What I have discovered thus far, and as Christian Wyman has elsewhere noted he's got this great book called My Bright Abyss, is that the mysteries of faith keep getting deeper the further I go in, and that despite having 7 postgraduate degrees in theology, which is a ridiculous number, I know so little about living a life of faith. I am, however, seeking to become more aware, more open, and more available to myself and others, and learning to ask better questions about what it means to be a follower of Jesus in the Catholic Church. And that has deep, deep meaning for me, still, as it has since I started. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Colby Dickinson, for that really wonderful meditation and kind of taking us on a journey and reading so much in it, especially so much parallel to Newman's own experience. That whole sense of the intellectual kind of reflection that he does in his work. We have about 20 minutes for questions or comments from the community here. So if you have a comment, let me know. We have another microphone. I might start off with the first comment and see where it goes from there. So you mentioned Newman's sense that I have no further doubts. But of course, reading the whole Apologia is about feeling the weight of 19th century skepticism and doubt. And I was just wondering, in your own experience, as you mentioned it with Newman, was that also, do you feel that as part of your intellectual journeys, dealing with some of the intellectual kinds of pressures of skepticism, of a Humean, or I mean, he talks about almost this severed ego of Descartes. I mean, he's very much aware of the isolation that he's under in his journey. Is there anything that you might speak to that in your experience?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in many ways we're very much still living with a lot of the same problems Newman faced in the 19th century. I mean, he was very much facing forms of skepticism that are still around today. I tend to be, and because I'm a very rational person, I tend to be very skeptical, you could say, of ordinary things. If someone runs to me and says there was a miracle that happened, I tend to think probably not. I'm not going to go along with this. So I would say none of those things, in a practical sense, were part of my struggle. I mean, I was still a Christian before this, and I was after, though some people may not think Catholic equals Christian. But for me, no, I didn't have those particular struggles. I do think, though, that notion of skepticism is one of the biggest things that holds people back. And I think the big problem, and I work on this with Newman's work in other ways, is that we've sort of given reason like complete hold over how we think of faith. So that if I have a skeptical moment where I'm thinking it doesn't make total sense, we just completely dismiss everything else that's there, as if it had no other benefit. So like earlier today I was working on something else about the virtues, and I was looking at the life of the virtues, and this is a complex, centuries-long discourse on how to find parts of yourself in your struggle and how to try to deal with things you're tempted to do. And it's as if in the modern period we just take all that and throw it out the window and say, well, but now we know better. Some of that stuff is silly and we've moved on. And I don't find too many students or adults who say, I'm going to try to take seriously the 7 cardinal virtues or the 7 deadly sins. We just kind of go, yeah, I know that's the old stuff. But there's this discourse that's ongoing that's about the fullness of the human being in everything we experience. And I think I struggle with the fact that even where your question comes from, it's been elevated to such a degree that we think that's where everything rests. And I find myself saying there's so many other resources available, within the Catholic Church specifically, to talk about who we are as people. And I want to focus on those. I'll get my hands on the ones that make the most sense to me, work with those, and see if the other stuff doesn't make sense later on. And I have found that very much to be the case for me. That if I really dive in and say I want to work on bettering myself in line with these great spiritual masters, other things begin to make sense about faith after the fact. So my skepticism tends to be not. I tend not to view it. I view it more as an intimate relationship in the sense of, Henry Nouwen once said the resurrection to him was a private, intimate affair among Jesus and his friends. So if you have problems believing it, don't worry about it. It was for the intimate friends. And I find myself saying, I want to be one of the intimate friends, and then maybe something like the resurrection will begin to make more sense to me. And I think that for me makes a lot more sense in handling those kind of comments.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to ask a question or make a comment?
I heard you say that you mentioned that it's hard for you to allow other people to tell you what you're feeling. And you also mentioned that you don't know how to put that feeling into words. So I ask you, how do you know the other people that are telling you what you're feeling? How do they know what you're feeling if you can't even put into words to describe it to them?
That's a great question. You know, I mentioned earlier in my talk the experience of letting the words of others become your words, translating those words into your own life. For me, that's always been the experience. So I may have an experience, I feel something, I'm not sure what's going on, and I'll talk to someone who may be better at discerning feelings, and I typically find that the words they give, they ring true. The word I love is they resonate. They resonate with me deeply, and I say, yes. Now I recognize that's what I was feeling. And it seems like that really is the experience I was having. I didn't have the words for it, but it becomes true. It becomes true for me after the fact, so to speak, after I realize and reflect on what it was I was feeling. So it doesn't feel to me, I don't think it should be a situation where you're like, I felt this, and someone tells you, and you go, no, that's not it, but I guess I should believe you. No, it's not that. It becomes for me a process of saying, that is what I was feeling. Yes, I was that way. And now that you help give me the words for it, I'm able to move in my own life in a different direction through it. And that for me is the process of letting those words become your words. So for example, the experience for me of working with Scripture, like when you pray through Scripture, you read the words of someone else, or maybe you read the words of a saint or someone else, and those words begin to resonate with your own experience to such a degree that you say, that's what I was trying to express and to say. That's what's going on. Oh, now I see. That's what I had been feeling and experiencing. I just didn't know how to describe it. And that's very much what I mean by that type of experience.
Did you bring that experience and read like psychology textbooks?
Well, yeah, of course. Of course. You'll read some book and say, yes, that's also my experience. Thank you for giving me the words. It doesn't have to be limited to faith. My point is, I began to discover and still discover there's a large ongoing tradition of faith that has been wrestling with these same questions I'm wrestling with for centuries. And so the words have such a deep, profound, let's say, significance if I want to take them on. But is it true? Sure. But I don't always find, a description of prayer in a psychology book, for example. So if I'm looking for that, I look elsewhere. That's a great question. Thank you. Other questions?
So you mentioned your respect for spaces. How lately you've had a real respect for space. It's had an impact on you. So it happens that I'm reading Catholic writer Evelyn Waugh right now, and he too seems to emphasize the importance of architecture. So I don't know if this is a feeling that's resonating with you, but can you try to articulate what is profound maybe about spaces, about architecture even?
Yeah, that's a great one. Thank you, Marcus. I think for me, there's something, and I don't want to say like, this is what I'm willing to grant as mystery. Is there something holy to a certain space? Who knows? What I do know is that when so many people go to a space wanting something of the holy in that space, or they go there repetitively with their prayers and their hopes, I feel like there's something that begins to take place in that space that says it's welcome here. Your prayers, your hopes, your dream, your faith is welcome in this space. And so for that reason, for me, in a way that I really can't even articulate sometimes, those spaces become significant spaces for me. Because, and again, it goes back to faith as relationship for me, because there are others who have come to this space looking for something, wanting something. And I go there, I guess, and almost enter into relationship with those people. I don't know if that makes, it's like maybe anonymously I'm entering into some sort of relationship with them. But I feel like because it was there in that space, there's something about being there that helps me to articulate an experience I too am going through. So going to a space that's marked off for silence, for example, I begin to find a silence within myself, Going to a space where people claim healings have happened, which is not something I do frequently. Honestly, part of my skeptical mind kicks in and I think, oh, come on. But what does it mean to go to that space open to the possibility of healing in my life? That I like. That I like a lot, and that I need. I have no idea what actually goes on with people. I've never been to Lourdes. Who knows what this water does? Maybe it's ordinary water, on and on. But going to a space where people recognize an openness to being healed, I love that idea. And I find that when I intentionally set myself on a course for that space, even on the way there, I'm opening up to a journey within myself that I wasn't open to maybe before. I had to actually go experience it. And that's what I liked about the Catholic tradition. It's so bodily, it's so messy. You know, it's places and talking to actual people. And, you know, when we say this transubstantiation is actually the body and blood. Ugh. And yet I want that messiness. That's how Mary Carr talks about it a lot in her memoir, Lit. Catholics are into that gory, messy crap. And she thinks that really speaks to us. That's why we like it. And I agree. You know, I say to myself, I want the messiness. I want to be actually on my feet or on my knees, walking in a direction. I want to talk to an actual person about what I'm going through. You know, and that is very meaningful to me. I got very frustrated, and this is not, understand, this is not every Protestant. I'm not trying to slam Protestantism at all. But I got very frustrated with certain Protestants I knew where it became a spiritualization of things to such a point that everything was symbolized away, or, you know, a lot of things became, well, the space doesn't matter so much. And then I found those people didn't get on their knees. You know, that's one of the differences too, right? Why do Catholics get on their knees so much? It's so bodily. You know, we're actually doing things. And for me, that has a deep meaning. Because I'm looking for that practice physically, and I'm looking for that space physically, and I'm looking to move from A to B physically, literally, in space. So I do think architecture matters. I think it matters a good deal. I think the spaces where we go to matter. I think the people who go to those spaces matter. And I think that's why it's interesting too when you have a holy site, I don't know, based on seeing the Virgin Mary dance around there, who knows what. But people go to that space and something in that space takes on a certain resonance. Who knows if the Virgin Mary showed up there or not, or if the statue actually cried. I don't know. This stuff weirds me out, Catholicism sometimes. And yet, I'd probably walk right up to it too and go, what's going on over here? And how am I open to this in the process of going up to it? I mean, I've walked through the churches in Rome, and you wait in line to watch a piece of the real cross, right, which is probably the real cross. But that's not the point to me. The point to me is, am I open to the reality of what the cross may be for me? Am I walking toward that place? Do I even know what that place is? Or am I hung up on the skepticism of, is it really the cross? I don't even care about that stuff. Which sounds weird, right? But what I want is the openness to touching the cross of Christ. And then it moves me in a very different way. And then I don't care what the material essence of the thing is, or if it's real or not. It doesn't bug me. So that's why the space is very important for me in that sense. And Catholicism to me was this long tradition of people saying, yes, we respect that. Yes, we have ways we talk about it. We have a whole tradition. It's not perfect, but we've tried to work on discussing those things. And then I say, okay, cool. I'd like to know how to be conversant in that language and to translate my experiences into that language. Does that make sense? Or sort of speak to your question? Maura's got a question.
How did you get to the point where you decided to study theology? And how did you sustain 7 degrees and continue to study it? And does that go into this conversation of conversion and faith? And how does the academic study of theology fit into that for you?
Yeah, I mean, maybe you heard it in my talk, but I really think of faith as, I think of theology as just one component of the life of faith. One of the biggest mistakes I have made and continue to make, and I think theologians make all the time, is thinking somehow theology is a substitute for the life of faith. I mean, what a disastrous idea that is. But we somehow think, because I do theology, I have this access to this world of faith. No, I don't have any privileged access to it. In fact, I'm as much a novice as anyone else. But I want to work in my theology to just call attention to that fact in some ways. So for me, theology is one component, but it's by no means the most important. In fact, I'm tempted to say theology is actually a very small part, a very small part of life of faith. I had an experience when I mentioned for 1 year I was a Methodist pastor, which was wild. I worked in a very small church under direct appointment of a Methodist bishop because my dad was a pastor. So that just meant I could do the things ministers did, but my dad would just kind of bless it all. So like, I'm not allowed to do consecration of the bread, and it was bread and grape juice. That's what we use in Methodist Church. So I wasn't allowed to bless the Wonder Bread and grape juice with, I wasn't ordained. So my dad would do it, and then I would take it to the church and perform the ceremony. Which meant if my dad forgot, I had to call him at church, and he would say, just hold the phone over the bread. Which happened, right? But in this church that I worked at, everyone there was over 65. They were all over 65, and I was like 22. I was very young. And, or no, I'd probably be 23, 24, I guess. So I was at this church thinking, oh my God, you are all looking at me thinking, I don't know what I'm talking about. I don't have a clue what I'm doing. All of you have been practicing your faith for years. So one of the first things I did when I was their pastor was to sort of decentralize the power as best I could. So whenever we'd have prayers at meals or pastoral moments, I asked this old lady in the church who was 92, I think, and she was amazing. And I just said to her, your prayers move me deeply. Can you be the one who prays for the community? And she felt so moved by that. She was like, thank you. And I was like, I just need to get out of your way. And then she would do that, and I felt the community responded saying, well, that's great that she's the one who does our prayers because she knows how to pray. And as their pastor, I didn't know what the hell I was doing. So I tend to look at my role as a theologian sort of along those lines. I'm trying to figure some stuff out, but it's a very small component. And if I can turn it over to people who know more than me on these matters, thank God for that. And that to me it's like the process of spiritual direction. You go to someone who can help you because they know about these spiritual matters. And if they don't, they'll refer you hopefully to someone else who knows more than they do. And in the life of faith, which is much fuller than any theology, that's a very important thing. Now, you said first, I'm giving a very long answer, but you said first, why did I get into theology, I think. This may sound naive. There's two reasons. One is that my family was very immersed in it, so I just thought, this is like the family trade. I'm going to go study it. That really is part of it, just the family trade. The second part was that I said to myself at some point in college, I'm really baffled. People say faith is the most important thing in the world, but then no one really takes that seriously. So should I take it seriously, or shouldn't I? And I kind of just wanted to figure that question out, because if it's not to be taken seriously, then I'm going to be the first person to step out and say, to hell with this. I'm not going to take it seriously. I went and looked at it. It clearly should not be taken seriously. And I was pretty content to say, if I find that to be the case, I'm out of here. I still kind of am, I guess, in a way. But the truth is, I went into it and said, oh man, there's a lot going on here that has a lot of integrity. And if this is the most important thing, I guess it's not wasting my time to go study it. It was pretty simple like that. And that was it. So when you talk to students who are like, I'm going to go on this mission trip or do one of the ABIs, because I'm just like, I heard they're pretty cool. I guess I'll check it out. I don't discount that as maybe the most significant thing they'll ever do. Yeah? Because it could be that once they're present to it and they reflect on it. And then good for them. If someone, your best friend said, come with me, let's go on this, and you're like, oh, okay. And then you say, is that a crappy reason? No, that could be an amazing reason. You listen to your friend, you wanted to bond in your friendship and go experience that ABI together. And it could change everything, if you're open to it. And I think that was more or less my experience of theology was, I'm going to find out if there's something here. And some people said it's important, I'll check it out. Okay.
Thank you very much. We'll once again just really thank you for this time with us today in this lecture. Our first lecture 2 years ago was with a psychologist. Last year we had a literary critic and now a theologian, so it's really been wonderful to see that kind of strategizing and negotiation of life and seeing Newman there as well, kind of as a part of that. Thank you very much. Colby will be here for a little while, so if you have a question or a comment that you might want to make, you might do that. Let's applaud.